Hello, and welcome to our hot topic on the 6 proposed amendments to the Florida Constitution that you'll see on your ballot this November. My name is Delia Johnson, and I'm a director with the League of Women Voters of Sarasota County. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan public policy organization that encourages informed and active participation in government. This presentation is held under our Education Fund, a nonpartisan 501c3 corporation with a mission of voter service and education. The League accepts both women and men as members. The League does not support or oppose political candidates or parties. Today, we offer an overview of the 6 constitutional amendments on the November ballot with some of the pros and cons for each. This discussion will be recorded and posted on our website and other media outlets. The recording is the property of the League. Written permission must be sought for the use of the video, which may not be edited or altered. Our guests today are Dr. Frank Alcock and Senator Lisa Carlton. The opinions expressed are strictly their own and may not coincide with the views of the League of Women Voters of Florida. Dr. Alcock is an associate professor of political science at New College of Florida. He has taught courses on world politics, international law, and environmental policy. He holds a PhD in political science from Duke University, a MA in international affairs from George Washington University, and a BA in economics from Binghamton University. Dr. Alcock appears regularly as a political analyst with ABC News in Sarasota and was a candidate for the Florida State Senate in 2016. Senator Lisa Carlton is an 8th-generation Floridian and co-owner and manager of the Mabry Carlton Ranch in Sarasota County. Senator Carlton practiced law in Sarasota County before entering public service. She was elected to represent the 70th District of the Florida House of Representatives and the 23rd District of the Florida Senate, and served on Florida's 2017-2018 Constitution Revision Commission. Let's get started with a brief look. Dr. Alcock is going to give us some context on the constitutional amendment. And Linda, I think that you're going to need to allow me to share my screen. There we go.
Should I start?
Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this event. I'm going to try to keep this very, very short. But Florida stands out among the 50 states in the United States for the number of ways that we are able to change our state constitution. We're currently on our 5th constitution. We've had it in place since 1968. We had a state constitutional convention. There's 5 ways that you can change the Constitution. The 2 most common are for the legislature to pass a resolution to place something on the ballot, or citizens to collect a very large number of signatures, and they could have something placed on the ballot as well. We also have recurring Constitution revision commissions, one that's general, one specific for tax and budget, that meet every 20 years, and it's staggered every decade. And it's possible that we could have another constitutional convention. So that adds up to 5. That's more than any other state in the union. The threshold for acceptance or approval on the part of voters is 60. You need 60% of voters to approve an amendment. That's been in place since 2006. 60% of voters have to approve it before it goes into the Constitution. Today, or this cycle, not today, but in 2020, we have 6 proposed changes to the state constitution, not like the CRC amendments that we saw in 2018. 4 of these are actually citizens' initiatives, and 2 of them were put on the ballot by the legislature. So just a little bit of background. One little last point that I would note, that it's really interesting to know whether it's a legislative resolution or if it's a citizens' initiative, just because if it's a citizens' initiative, it means that the legislature probably doesn't want it in the Constitution, otherwise it would put it on themselves. So we'll learn a little bit more about the amendments coming up now.
Okay, thank you. And Senator Carlton will start with amendment number 1.
Thank you very much. Appreciate being asked to come this evening. It's an honor being on the panel with Dr. Alcock, and look forward to informing the participants about the 6 constitutional amendments on the ballot in November. So when you go to the ballot in November, as we just mentioned, you're not only going to be voting for certain political races, you're going to be voting yes or no on 6 constitutional amendments. Beginning with Amendment 1. We'll start there. Amendment 1 is a citizen initiative, which is, as Dr. Frank Alcock just said, required about 700,000 signatures to even get to the ballot. So it was sort of one of those grassroots efforts, if you will, from the ground up. And Amendment 1 is amending language, amending is the proposal to amend language in the Florida Constitution to require that only U.S. citizens vote in elections. The current language in the Florida Constitution provides that every U.S. citizen can vote. This proposal would change every to only U.S. citizens. So the proponents of this amendment claim that they feel as if the language in the Constitution is not clear. It is not excluding non-U.S. citizens from voting. And they don't really present a lot of facts in support of their case, because we really have no record in Florida of non-citizens voting or of any voting district allowing non-citizens to vote. And so some people would claim that this is sort of a solution in search of a problem. And the opponents would say, why would we put that in the Constitution? The current language is very clear, and this amendment is not necessary. And so you have those 2 sides of this particular amendment. Obviously, you're going to have to make up your mind yourself of whether you think every citizen is clear enough, or if you think only a citizen would be clearer. So that is the decision point on this amendment. Dr. Alcock, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that one.
I think, no, you did a very good job, Lisa, of providing an overview. I'm not aware of anybody challenging our state constitution with respect to having a non-citizen being allowed to vote. So there's a necessity question, but the change is rather subtle. It's just simply the language, and I don't think there'd be any adverse impacts of the amendment. So I'm kind of a big shrug on this one.
You know, I'm kind of I like your phrase there. I'm kind of a big shrug. And I was, you know, but I would say it is the Constitution. Do we need to muck it up with language that is not necessary when the language written there is already clear enough? So I'm personally probably going to vote no on this amendment, but because I just don't think it's necessary. I think the Constitution is the current language is very clear.
Okay, thank you very much. And we will go on to amendment number 2. And
okay, this one is getting a lot of action and buzz. It is Amendment 2, which would raise Florida's minimum wage. It's a citizens initiative, and it's organized by Florida for a Fair Wage, and it's largely John Morgan is behind this outfit from Morgan & Morgan, and he's put on some other amendments in the past, most notably the marijuana change to the marijuana laws. Florida hospitality industry is largely trying to organize some resistance to this. What this amendment says is that we have a current minimum wage at $8.56 an hour. That minimum wage would increase to $10 an hour effective on September 30th, 2021, about 11 months, give or take, after the election. Beginning in September 30th, every year thereafter, the minimum wage would increase by $1 an hour until it reaches $15 an hour on September 30th, 2026. And thereafter, future minimum wages would be adjusted annually for inflation beginning the following year, September 30, 2027. So Most of you that pay any attention to politics know that there is a movement to raise minimum wage, both nationally as well as state by state, to $15 an hour as soon as possible. There tends to be aggressive schedules out there for those, especially for states that are far apart from that. So there is both attempts, there are acts, there are sort of national legislation that is pretty far from, well, it might make it through the House, but it's pretty far from being passed at the moment. There's also a number of attempts down at the state level to move to a $15 an hour wage. Now, some of these are done through the legislature or through legislative action at the state level. And then in some cases, minimum wages have been increased through ballot initiatives. There are 7 states right now that have actually passed legislation to raise their minimum wages to $15 an hour. All of those, though, did it through sort of legislation. Their legislature passed laws. There have been a number of states, a fairly large number, that have gotten minimum wage increases through ballot initiatives, whether they were put on by a legislature or some sort of citizens initiative, but none actually have done it that way to get up to $15 an hour. So if Florida were to do this, we would be, I'm pretty sure, the first state to actually use the ballot initiative to put in place a requirement to move up to $15 an hour for a living or a minimum wage. Okay, what are some of the pros and the cons, or the upsides and or downsides or risks that are being debated? Clearly, in a state like Florida, lifting the minimum wage from $8.56 an hour to $15 an hour in well under a decade is going to have a significant impact on incomes for minimum wage and low income workers. So it'll make a difference in a lot of people's lives that need it. There have been a number of studies that look at who these income increases impact. Obviously, it should have positive impacts on inequality writ large, but in particular, racial and gender inequalities. Those women and also a lot of minorities that are often marginalized tend to benefit a little bit more. So this will help in that area. And it definitely will lift a number of folks above the poverty line. There's a running joke out there that Florida's booming economy for a number of years. It's not that hard to get a job in Florida. You just need like 3 of them in order to get by. And so beyond the actual income increases, you can actually see some potential for working families or lower middle class families to have parents work less, because they wouldn't need multiple jobs in order to pay their bills. They actually might be able to get by on 1 or 2. What is this? Sounds great. What's the downside, or what's the risk of increasing the minimum wage? The arguments fall into a few different categories. One is the reaction on the part of economic firms would be to actually cut jobs. And so higher minimum wage is not going to help you if you lose your job. So to the extent that jobs are lost, that would be a bad thing, or hours could get cut. This could actually accelerate just economic trends towards automation of a number of low-skilled areas of the workforce. So the loss of jobs and potential loss of income for some is one concern. There's another concern out there about, would this affect small businesses disproportionately, put the squeeze on, particularly in a time where we have COVID concerns that are whacking our economy hard. Might this actually put small businesses under in ways that we're not going to see the impacts on larger firms with more employees? And there's a third set of concerns around, is this going to affect prices, whether it be consumer prices generally in the state of Florida or in specific areas like the hospitality industry, food prices, hotel prices. So those are the number of there's a number of concerns that are out there, and reasons why some folks think that we shouldn't be raising the minimum wage, or as aggressively as you're seeing it in this in this proposal. I think what do the signs say? What do the analyses say? There's a whole lot of them. The economics profession has been working and doing studies on minimum wage impacts on the economy in particular sectors for a very long time. What I would actually, tease out there are some differences with respect to what analyses say. What does the record say? So when we've had increases in wages before in other states or cities, what has actually happened in terms of some of these costs and benefits, which might be a little bit different than analyses that are looking at projections, what would actually happen either statewide or on a national scale to aggressively move to $15 an hour. And you might get some different pictures depending upon what happened in the past, projecting into the future, because this could be different than what might have happened in another state. And there's also surveys of businesses. What would they do? And you might actually see a different picture emerge if you're relying upon what a survey of a number of firms, what they would say. As somebody that I'm not, I was an economist for the Energy Department, but not somebody that is versed on a day-to-day basis. A lot of the balance, I think, of the studies out there on what has happened before in other places, the impacts on jobs to date have been fairly modest to somewhat marginal, depending upon how quickly you increase the wage and where you're talking about. I think there are impacts on prices. They tend to be small overall, but they're higher when you're looking at a particular sector. And then in the state of Florida, when we have an outsized hospitality and tourist sector, they might be a little bit larger than we've seen in prior studies that are economy-wide in a particular state. The surveys, though, there's just lots of anxiety with respect to both COVID and the state of the current economy. And so if you're reading a news report that's looking at a recent survey of businesses, what would they do? You're going to see that anxiety reflected in some of the answers, and that might paint a more negative picture of what would happen if we were to pass this amendment. All things told, then, I do think there are some clear rewards and good things that would happen if this were to pass. There are some risks out there. I'm going to come down on the side of, I'm going to vote, I think, for this amendment. I do acknowledge some of those risks. I think you need to be careful what type of information that you're looking at. Congressional Budget Office has done a good national study. EPI does a lot of work on the minimum wage. And I wouldn't just dismiss some articles that might paint a bleaker picture, but just be sensitive to where they're coming from and what particular experience sort of in the historical record they're focusing on. So I think we've kept it at a reasonable length. Lisa, what say you?
So thank you for that overview and good discussion on Amendment 2. I would say behind the warmth of this amendment is a plethora of consequences, most of them negative if Amendment 2 passes. I think one of the suggestions was, let's look at a city or an area where this has happened. So you have to go and look at a place like Seattle that passed a $15 minimum wage act by 2021. And what happened there, and what in the reports you read are, what did businesses like daycare facilities do? Well, they passed the price, they raised their prices, they cut hours, and they got rid of employees. The raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour in this state would devastate an already challenged economy. You are going to see higher prices passed on to the consumer, job loss, incredible increase in job loss, as well as, there's no upside, because now if the amendment passes, it's in the Constitution, so there's nothing you can do about it. It's very challenging to go back and change that again. So I think one of the things is you look at this citizen initiative. It is a citizen initiative. They required a lot of signatures. They've raised $5-6 million in support of this amendment. So they are lobbying for this amendment very strong. But You have to be very, very careful, especially the timing could not be worse for this amendment with COVID going on. We already have businesses that are stressed, small businesses that are extremely stressed, especially in the hospitality industry and the restaurants. And, you know, I think this would really send more businesses just over the edge, completely over the edge if this were to pass. So I would really ask you to really pause and really look at the effect that this possibly has, this negative effect that this would have on our economy and on our small businesses. So I would be a strong no on Amendment 2.
Okay.
Shall we move on?
Yes, we shall. Amendment 3.
Okay, this is another fun one. Amendment 3, all voters vote. This has been in the works for a few different cycles. All voters vote in primary elections for the state legislature, the governor, and the cabinet. And so the language says that this would allow all voters, all registered voters, to vote in primaries for state legislature, governor, and cabinet, regardless of political party affiliation. All candidates for an office, including party-nominated candidates, appear on the same primary ballot. The two highest vote getters advance to the general election. If only two candidates qualify, no primary is held, and the winner is determined in a general election. The candidate's party affiliation may appear on the ballot as provided by law. Okay, this is often, or sometimes, but more often than not, referred to an open primaries ballot change or change to our Constitution. It is in a class, I think, of changes to a primary system that's referred to open primaries. It's a little bit different, and that this is technically referred to as a nonpartisan blanket primary. And so Florida's primary system is technically a closed primary. And so you have to be registered as a Republican to vote in a Republican primary. You have to be registered as a Democrat to vote in a Democratic primary. There are other states that do things differently. There is not one way that you could actually run an open primary system. Sometimes you can allow for people to move across and vote in whichever primary that you want. Perhaps you only limit to those that are not registered in a party and allow them to vote in the primary of their choice. Lots of ways of doing things. This particular variant, the nonpartisan blanket primary, a little bit more radical in that what happens at this primary stage is it is open. Parties can have some other type of process to signify that somebody is going to represent the party, that's a legitimate candidate of the party, but it's not the actual primary vote that's typically used to do that. And so you may have an unlimited number of candidates that are either running under the banner of a party or not. And what happens is the top two move on to a general election. The only states that do this are Washington and the state of California. They have passed changes through their constitution or through a legislative change to do this. Attempts to do what Florida is doing, to change it through a ballot initiative, have failed in states like Arizona, Oregon, and some other states. And so this movement has lost some of its momentum over the last, the better part of the last decade for this particular form of a change. The reason why is political parties don't like it. Neither the Republican nor the Democratic Party is a fan of the top two system. And the reason for that is what this sacrifices. I'll start with the downside, is party autonomy, in that the parties cannot guarantee that through their own processes they'll be moving on a candidate of their choice to a general election. And so the control that political parties have over who ends up getting elected and then who represents them in a general election is weakened and threatened by this. The other reason is you risk a guarantee that you're going to have a representative from your party in a general election. It is possible in certain areas that the top two vote getters would be from the same party, or perhaps somebody that's running as a third party or nonpartisan candidate finishes in the top two. One of the representatives of the major parties might not make it. There are also some like Green Party and some other third parties that don't like this, in part because they want to be guaranteed a slot in the general election, even though there's no way they're ever going to win when they get to that point. So political parties in general are not fans, and that's why when political parties mobilize, they've been able to shoot down amendments such as this fairly effectively after Washington and California approved it. Is there any upside to something like this at all? I think that there is. And let me just mention that the vast majority of our political districts, particularly in the legislature, the governor is statewide, so it wouldn't apply. But the vast majority of state legislative districts are not competitive. And that the numbers and the polarization that we have almost guarantees that whoever represents a particular political party, whoever wins a primary is ultimately going to cakewalk into the legislature. And so there's not much competition in most political districts. And I actually think, just like in economics, in politics, competition can be a very good thing. It can have a salutary impact on our politics, in particular with respect to the sense of accountability that our elected leaders have to the broader district in its entirety. And so I do think that many, if not most, of our elected representatives, they might not be bad people, but they don't exactly think that they're accountable to everybody. They're just accountable to either the narrow slice of the electorate or the few people with deeper pockets that keep them in office. And so one of the things that you might want to ask yourself is, what do you value more? Do you place a lot of value on competition and accountability in our electoral system? If so, this might be something to strongly consider. If you're worried about the risk to political party autonomy and that guarantee that you're always going to have somebody from your own political party in the general election, then that could outweigh what you see in terms of a benefit. So this is interesting. My own personal opinion, I am a huge fan of something called ranked choice voting, which we could save for another time, that actually captures all the good things in this proposal without really risking some of the bad stuff. But that's not what we have on our ballot. We have a nonpartisan blanket primary proposal. There's some risks here. I understand them. I still think it's better than what we have. And so I'm going to vote yes on this one, just to shake things up.
Senator Carlton.
Thank you. So I think the mistake the proponents of Amendment 3 did is they tried to put too much in this amendment. They not only tried to change our system of elections from a closed primary to an open primary, they threw in the top two, ranked top two. And so what they've done is they have created an opportunity for even more gamesmanship in elections if you pass this amendment. So if you like games in elections and games in politics, and you would like to see more of that, then vote for Amendment 3. If you would like to avoid that as much as possible, vote no. You know, opponents of this amendment have not only said, well, you know, it creates more gamesmanship. Well, how is that the case? I have read a report. Now, this is not going to be a pure example of what could happen, because if this were in place, behavior in elections and political campaigns would change completely from the way things are done now. But if this had been in place in the last gubernatorial election, what you would have had is you would have had Adam Putnam and Tim DeSantis move to the general election. All right. So I don't think that creates more openness. I don't think that creates more choice, because you could potentially go into a November election with your top two choices are either 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, 2 independents. That is not more of a choice. That is actually less of a choice. So compare that to how our open primaries work today, because we do have a version of open primaries in today's world. We have a version where if there are only candidates in one party in an election, in that primary, people of the other party can vote. And this played out in our last sheriff's race in Sarasota County. Kurt Hoffman, who won the primary, had no Democrat in that election in November. He was elected in August. It was an open primary. Because of this little loophole we have of the write-in loophole, there were no write-in candidates, and so everybody got to participate in that election. That's very good. Now, I do think we should clean up the write-in loophole so that there aren't games played with that. But again, that's not what this amendment does. Amendment 3 will create chaos, confusion, and in my opinion, actually less choice for people in the November election. So I would really ask that you very carefully consider this amendment, and I will be voting no on Amendment 3.
Thank you. Just as a point of clarification, Dr. Alcock, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's also now, you were referring it to blanket primary. It's also top 2 primary or jungle primary. Are those the other two?
The technical name that the political scientists would use would be a non-partisan blanket primary. The short version is the top 2, and that's the one I think seen the most. But it's also been referred to as a jungle primary because of the uncertainty that it introduces. I just to come back one little for a second, a small rejoinder. I do agree with Lisa on the loophole in terms of the write-in vote for Florida. That's just a no-brainer that we should clean up. I think there are some risks there that it's possible that you could have gotten on a major race, no Democratic or no Republican candidate if you're talking about a particular district. Knowing ahead of time how it works, though, I think the outcomes probably would have been a little bit different. I think you would have seen a Democratic candidate running against a Republican candidate for the governor. And again, I understand the doom and gloom projections, but just take a look at who dislikes this. It's not Republican or Democrat. It's the people that are in power in the least competitive districts. They're the ones that hate this the most. And so I don't mind shaking it up a little bit, making them sweat.
Nice. Thank you. And on to Amendment 4.
So I'll start off the discussion on Amendment 4. As Dr. Alcock said in the beginning, Florida has more ways to amend our Constitution than any other state, and one of those ways is citizen initiatives. And there are certain segments of Florida, certain groups in Florida that don't like any constitutional amendments. They think that we should never amend Florida's Constitution ever again. I'm not sure that was the vision of the founders of the 1968 Constitution, but that is their vision. And thus they have created Amendment 4. It is a citizen initiative. I will say it is a very well-funded citizen initiative. As of the last report, they have raised $9 to $10 million in support of Amendment 4. So a little bit later in this election cycle, you'll probably begin to see the advertising, whether it's TV, cable, whatever, maybe mail. You will see Amendment 4 very heavily lobbied for. I would ask that you really take a careful look at that amendment. I will be opposed to that amendment. It requires that for any future amendments on the ballot, they will be on the ballot. If that amendment passes, the very next election cycle, that amendment will go back on the ballot. So in other words, you've got to pass the amendment twice before it's in the Constitution. So it's as if the amendment is saying, did you really, really mean that? So, you could have a overwhelming, obviously the amendments have to pass by 60%. The amendment passes by 60% in 2020. Now at the next election, it's got to pass again by 60%. This is an amendment that I can say it offends me a little bit. It offends me that somebody thinks that I went to the polls and I voted for a constitutional amendment, but I wasn't really sure. So you're going to ask me again in another year of whether I really meant what I said in the last election. I find it a little bit offensive. I find it also, and I think this is goes back to one of the questions that one of the league members sent in early on that Dr. Alcock and I were given. And the main concern was, how would this amendment delay voter intent? Well, you know what? It delays voter intent. So look at the last cycle of constitutional amendments. So if we were sitting here today at the 2020 ballot and having to revisit all of those constitutional amendments, the one, take in particular the one that's caused the most legal sort of discussion and process, the felons, restoring the felons' rights to vote. We wouldn't be having any of that because we would have to vote for it a second time before we ever got to that. So it is, I will be voting no. I think that it is a delay of voter intent. I think that voters go to the polls, they intentionally vote yes or no, and I don't think we need to ask them a second time. Now, do we ever want to revisit issues? Well, look, we're revisiting right now Amendment 2. We're revisiting the minimum wage in Florida because we have a minimum wage provision in Florida's Constitution. So there are opportunities after something is in the Constitution and has either been working or not working for a while that either the Constitution Revision Commission or another citizen initiative, you can revisit that. And so I think this is just an unduly burdensome amendment. I think it's offensive to voters and it delays voters' intent. Anything, Dr. Alcock, for mixing it up?
Thank you, Lisa. I think this is going to be the first one that Lisa and I are squarely in agreement on Amendment 4. Florida's Constitution, I mean, Chesterfield Smith chaired that original convention back in 1968. He was quite a character. But they intentionally made Florida's Constitution something that could evolve with a state that they saw that was going to be changing rapidly. And it was very important to him, and it was important to all of the folks that were on that commission, that the citizens of Florida be the ultimate repository for change. I think the change away from a simple majority for approving a constitutional amendment to a supermajority of 60%, I think that was actually a good thing. We were pretty whimsical historically, and you increase the bar and raise the bar. 60%, no easy task getting an amendment over that line. I think that's enough in terms of a little bit of a check or a constraint on the will of the citizens. I think this shift to having to do it twice really does empower those folks that would rather not have the citizens weigh in on things they might be frustrated about because they don't believe their elected leaders are doing what they'd like them to be doing. And I think it just goes too far in the other direction. So to stop something, all you need is 40%, get 40% or more of Florida to agree that you want to reject a change, and you can do it. If you actually make voters run through that hurdle, or the supporters of amendment twice, you're actually, you're raising that bar incredibly high. Each electorate, especially if we move from presidential to congressional years, is different. It's shaped different. 2 bites at the apple when you only need 40% can be very, very easy for organized interest to pretty much shoot down anything that you want. And if you're worried about too much on the ballot, now you're going to have things that'll straddle 2 more. So that's probably going to put a little bit more on your ballot. I think chewing on just this last 2018 cycle, my takeaway is not necessarily it's too easy to pass things. I just think voters struggled last cycle with too much on their ballot. It was a 1 in 20 year process, the CRC. They really loaded up. I mean, Lisa, you were on it. It was hard. There's a lot of things that you wanted to do. Packaging and bundling things together caused some angst for citizens. And I think that in this particular cycle, they just ran into a bit of mental fatigue. We might just revisit that in terms of, how might we be able to simplify things that are on the ballot going forward. But I look historically, especially since that supermajority is passed, I might not agree with everything that's been passed through the Citizens Initiative or Legislative Initiative, but I think a 60% threshold, I tend to trust the citizens of Florida more often than not. They've done a reasonably good job. They kind of checked out this last election, and just because I think there is so much that was on the ballot, they pretty much approved just about everything. So I agree with Lisa. I don't like this one. I think it makes it far too difficult to make the changes that are necessary, and it prolongs change, especially if there's more than 60% of voters in Florida agree that change is necessary. You're going to make it much more difficult to actually get it done. So I'm a no.
Okay.
I'll add one thing to that, because I think Dr. Alcock brought up a very important point about one of the reasons the proponents say they want Amendment 4 is because there's too many amendments on the ballot, and there's too many, I think you used the word whimsical things that have been put in the Constitution. But really, if you look at the 140 or so amendments that have been proposed since the 1968 Constitution Revision Commission, 64% of those are proposals from the legislature. They're not even citizens' initiatives. Now, you could say, well, that doesn't mean they're good or bad, but for the most part, probably the legislature is probably not placing whimsical things on the ballot, like, you know, the pregnant pigs amendment that was back in the early 90s and that kind of thing. So really, you know, when the 60% went into effect, I think really that cleaned up that whimsical problem that we hear about. And I agree with Dr. Alcock. That was a really high standard. I mean, higher than Dr. Alcock. Is that higher than most other states? I think it probably is, the 60%.
You know, that's a good question. I remember I took a look at this a few years back, just in anticipation of questions when I was doing stuff for the Collins Center. It is a mixed bag. There are a lot of them out there that are simple majorities. There are some super majorities, and there are a few that are even more than a simple majority. And it also does change. If you recall, when in your work with the CRC, depending upon the nature of the, you know, the change, or whether it's something that's coming through the legislature and it has to do with taxes, or something that's fiscal and budget, there can be, you know, different thresholds, which can be confusing to people. But it's I think overall our 60% threshold is pretty healthy and pretty high relative to what happens in other states.
It's healthy, and just as sort of one of these, you know, here your cocktail conversation. It's interesting if you go back and you look at when the 60% was on the ballot in 2006, that amendment actually passed by 57%.
Yeah, I remember that was pretty, yeah. So, and so with the pregnant pig, which happened a little earlier, a couple of years earlier, which from an administrative policy standpoint, I mean, I don't really think it was a bad, you know, but the idea that we were getting to the point where we're worrying about sort of the actual sizes of a pig pen in a constitution was a little over the top. Also, I think if you recall, we had that back and forth on the approving or mandating a Florida rail. We approved it, and then we flipped around and changed their mind. And collectively, those things, I think, stood out in the public's mind. And that was one of the reasons that 58% of Floridians voted to increase the threshold from 50 to 60%.
I think the 60% stops those whimsical things, hopefully, from happening. And really, you know, Amendment 4 is all about delaying voter intent. So hopefully, you'll really, the members will really take a pause before they vote for Amendment 4.
Thank you. And on to Amendment 5.
Amendment 5 and Amendment 6 are the last two amendments we're going to talk about today. And as was mentioned earlier, on your ballot are a mix of citizen initiatives and joint resolutions, which are proposed by the Florida legislature. Just so you know, the Florida legislature has access to the ballot. They don't have to do signatures and things like that citizens would have to do, but they do have to pass joint resolutions or proposals on the ballot by a supermajority, by 60% in both chambers. So there are some filtering points, if you will, before something leaves the legislature and goes to the ballot. In addition to that, when joint resolutions are passed in the legislature by 60%, there is a part that the Supreme Court plays in all of these amendments. Quite frankly, the Supreme Court will review language and make sure that it's appropriate for the ballot, and that it is in plain language and people can understand it. So there are some sort of filters there, even for legislative proposals that make the ballot. These last two amendments, Amendment 6 is an extension of the current Save Our Homes portability period for homestead exemption. Homestead exemption property tax discount has been in our state constitution since 1935. In 2000, this clears up and language that creates an unfair situation where a homeowner would sell their home towards the end of one calendar year, and their new home is not built by January 1 of the year after the next. In other words, they have a little over a year to finish their new home to receive the homestead exemption by January 1. So what this does is it clears up a loophole that frustrates the original intent of the Save Our Homes benefit. So if this is adopted, it would give homeowners a 3-year timetable to transfer their Save Our Homes benefit to their new home instead of the current 2-year time frame. So it really is, when you read the amendment, for those that were in the state during the original Save Our Homes movement, it clears up sort of an unintended loophole that was created in the original language and really has just taken a few years to sort of play out. And so that situation has happened to citizens across the state of Florida. They went to Tallahassee, lobbied the legislature, and the legislature agreed, passed a joint resolution again by 60% in both the House and the Senate, and this is on the ballot. One of the lead questions that I think is a very good question for Amendment 5 is, well, wouldn't passage of this amendment impact local property taxes? Because as we know, property taxes are really what funds our local government here, our schools and our local government and services. And so another requirement, which I think Dr. Alcock was from a previous constitutional amendment, is that all constitutional amendments, when they're on the ballot, the voters be given the fiscal impact of voting for that amendment. So it is estimated that this would decrease local property taxes by about an annual $1.8 million in the next fiscal year, and would eventually grow to $10.2 million annually. An argument could be made that the 2 years is long enough, and to extend it to 3 is just too long, and it's going to cost local government too much money. I would tend to disagree with that. I don't think the fiscal estimate on this is enough to really make that much of a difference statewide. And I do think that there were certain intentions with the original Save Our Homes amendment, and I think this helps in those situations, albeit they might be rare. It helps in those situations where somebody could possibly lose their Save Our Homes because they can't get a new home built fast enough, especially if you think about it in light of lots of delays going on in the world right now. So it's a little bit of a timely discussion with building supplies and things like that. So I think this really helps out that situation, and you do have to balance the fiscal on it. But I would encourage you to vote for Amendment 5 to close that loophole, that unintended consequence.
Thank you, Lisa. I think that was a very good on the specifics, and I'm not sure just yet how I'll vote on this, but I don't really have much heartburn with respect to the specifics. And I do think all things considered, where you're talking about statewide revenue, for local governments, that's a pretty small amount. I do both for this and the other one, though, I will register a general point of concern that I do have with our property tax system here in the state of Florida. Local governments, municipal governments depend pretty heavily, and in this state we don't have income taxes. And so property tax is an important revenue source for the state, in addition to sales taxes. And when you're in times of trouble and those sales taxes drop, it just becomes ever more important. There's a reliance there on property taxes. And what we have is we have a property tax system that's, there's a lot of inequality in the system, and it's not there because we're trying to be bad to certain types of folks, but our homestead exemption and a number of other things that we've built into our property tax code provides breaks and advantages for certain types of Floridians, but not for all Floridians. And so when property taxes are important and you keep putting breaks into the system, you know, you're left with a couple of choices, which is you're going to put a big strain on your local and municipal governments, or they're going to have to compensate by increasing the taxes on those that are not protected. And so those that don't have or don't benefit from the protection of the homestead exemptions that we make changes often are typically new arrivals that are coming to the state for the first time that have to come in at very high in terms of their property tax rate, or folks that have second or third properties, but those are often rental properties, and those higher taxes get passed off into higher rental rates for a number of Floridians. And so some of our other people, the most vulnerable in the state that are having the hardest time, are not property owners, but they rent, and they're the ones sometimes that continue to get pinched from some of the breaks that, for good reasons, we're trying to protect certain well-deserving people, but it often puts pressure at other areas of the system. So there's just a general, you know, just a general sense of uncomfortableness that I have with, you know, the frequent changes to our property tax system. Try to help certain folks out, but usually there's a cost to that other folks have to pay for. In fairness to our legislature, just one point that I'd make, Lisa, some people have asked me, is this all political? So they, you know, does the legislature keep putting these changes to our Constitution and property tax just to curry some favor? And a lot of people don't realize that most of our relevant property tax law in the state of Florida is in the Constitution. So the legislatures can't pass something at will. If they want to make changes, even if they sound like simple housekeeping or closing loopholes, they actually have to go back into the Constitution. And in order to do that, they have to put something before the voters. So it's not all political manipulation. They need to ask the voters if they're going to make changes to the property tax code.
That's important. I think that's, Dr. Alcock, I really appreciate you mentioning that, because I think that is important, because Amendment 5 and Amendment 6, and there is no other way to accomplish those goals of Amendment 5 and Amendment 6
right,
other than a constitutional amendment. And so I think that's a really important point, because some people look at constitutional amendments, and if the legislature can accomplish this by a statute, then I don't want to use the Constitution in place of statutory change. And so I think that's a really important point, and a good segue to Amendment 6, which is also an amendment that I'll segue for you there. There you go.
Thank you.
which is also an amendment that relates to homestead property tax. Again, as I mentioned before, we've had homestead property tax in the state constitution since the early 30s. In 2006, a previous constitutional amendment allowed veterans who were 65 or older to have a discount on their homestead. That discount was then later amended in a 2012 constitutional amendment to active military personnel, to include active military personnel. This is a further amendment of that would allow that exemption. Currently, that exemption ends when the veteran dies. And so the spouse does not get to assume that discount when their veteran spouse passes away. So this amendment would transfer those savings to the surviving spouse until they remarry, sell, or otherwise dispose of the property. And again, I think it better reflects the intent of the policy when it was enacted. You know, it seems a little unfair that you've lived in a home and you've had a benefit of homestead exemption and your spouse dies and all of a sudden it goes away. So this sort of clears that up. Again, it's a frustration of the original language that this is now happening. There was a question from one of the league members that said, how does this affect the spouse if they remarry or they move? Well, you lose the exemption if you remarry or you move. So that's very clear that you don't get to take it with you into another marriage or another home. So that is a constraint on it. Again, you know, always important to look at the fiscal, you know, what effect does this have on property taxes, which is the bread and butter, if you will, of local government coffers and their budgets. And the fiscal on this one is even less than the fiscal on Amendment 5. The fiscal on this one is indeterminate impact. So really very little to no impact on the property tax coffers. So I would, I'll be voting yes on Amendment 5 and Amendment 6 because of that balance with the fiscal. I do think Dr. Alcock made some very good points though about, you know, the piecemeal way we do tax reform in the state of Florida. And so that maybe is a discussion for another day.
Okay.
And I'm going to be pretty simple on this one. I'll just agree with Lisa. There's not really a reason to vote no on Amendment 6. So concerns that I have about our tax code, I'll pick on another amendment to do that, not this one. So I'll vote yes.
All right, thank you. Any final comments specific to any of the amendments? All right. Dr. Alcock and Senator Carlton, we are so grateful to have you with us today to offer your insights. We learned a lot. The general election on November 3rd will have a broad impact across government since it is federal, state, and local races in addition to the 6 proposed amendments we've discussed. Don't miss these deadlines. We also recommend that you check your voter status now. You can check that with the Supervisor of Elections office or online. There are 3 ways to vote in Florida. The most important thing to remember is that you do need to have your ballot in by 7 p.m. on election day. Viewers, unfortunately, to keep with to be respectful of your time, we were not able to take questions today. But if we did not address your questions, we do suggest that you go to the League of Women Voters information resource online, vote411.org, also available in Spanish. You're able to enter your address to see the candidates, the issues, the amendments, get additional information. And so we do recommend that you take advantage of that resource. Thank you. Oh, I'm just going to leave it at that so you can write down that information. A special thank you to our volunteers and especially our Zoom host, Linda Thompson, today. And finally, please remember that your vote is your voice. The League of Women Voters of Sarasota County thanks you for joining us today.